Hello, everyone, and welcome back. The FBI keeps files on cases so disturbing they remain permanently sealed, not because of the crime, but because of who committed it. Sometimes the most terrifying predators don't look the part. They offer you a warm cup of chamomile tea. They hike the exact same national forest trails as you, and they leave behind encrypted messages that should never, ever be solved. Tonight, we're opening 3 classified case files that prove how close evil really is. From an undercover assignment that went horrifyingly wrong to a decoded letter that broke the FBI's top analyst. Before we start, where are you listening from? Let me know in the comments. Also, YouTube tells me that only about 4% of the people who watch these videos are actually subscribed. If you love these dark cases and you're in that other 96%, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It really helps this channel unearth the stories they tried to bury. Now, turn off the lights, lock your doors, and let's begin. Story 1. I still measure rooms. I know how that sounds. But every time I walk into a hotel, a rental, any room I've never been in before, my feet start counting steps from wall to wall before my brain even catches up. I don't decide to do it. It just happens. Like breathing. Like checking behind you in a parking garage. You do it enough times, and the body takes over. It started in the winter of 2016. And before I get into it, I need you to understand something about me. I am not someone who scares easily. I've been on the wrong end of a weapon more than once. I've talked down people who were 2 seconds from doing something they couldn't take back. I've worked cases that would keep a normal person up for a month. None of it follows me around the way this does. My name is Kelly Scott. At the time of this case, I was a special agent with the FBI's Missing Persons and Undercover Unit, based out of Portland, Oregon. And what I'm about to tell you is the case that genuinely changed how I move through the world. It started with paperwork. It almost always does. A clerk in our financial crimes division ran a routine cross-reference in early February and flagged something that looked, at first glance, like a minor clerical issue. 7 men. 7 separate Social Security accounts, all 7 receiving regular disability or retirement disbursements. And all 7, every single one, had been reported missing. The checks were still being cashed, not by the men themselves, by an authorized payee. One woman listed as the legal representative for all 7 accounts, depositing checks like clockwork at ATMs scattered across the Portland metro area, weeks and months after these men had vanished. The first missing man on the list was Earl Merritt, 67 years old, schizophrenic, no stable housing history going back almost a decade. His daughter Nicole had filed a missing persons report with the Portland PD the previous November. The local response had been effectively nothing. Earl had a history of disappearing for stretches. He was the kind of person the system had been quietly losing for years and not particularly rushing to find. But Nicole kept calling. She kept following up. And eventually, her persistence is what got the flag in our system in the first place. The authorized payee for Earl, and for all 6 other missing men, was a woman named Dorothy Wagner. I pulled everything we had on her. 62 years old, no criminal record of any kind. She was active in her church, known in the neighborhood, reportedly the kind of woman who brought food to sick neighbors and stayed late after community events to help clean up. She had operated a boarding house called Rosewood Manor for over a decade, a 3-story Victorian on the north side of the city. She took in, by her own description, the people no one else would. Former addicts, parolees, elderly men with nowhere to go. She looked on paper and by reputation like a genuinely good person. We couldn't get a warrant. Not yet. Acting as an authorized payee for a tenant is legal. Without hard evidence that these men were dead, a judge wasn't signing off on anything. And if we moved too fast and Dorothy caught wind of us, any evidence she had could be gone before we got through the front door. There was one option. Go through the front door myself. I spent about a week building a cover identity. Stopped washing my hair, bought clothes from a thrift store, roughed them up a little, created a background, a woman named Hannah, recently released from a short stint, substance history, looking for a room and a reset. The kind of person Dorothy Wagner, apparently, had a weakness for. I was wired. I had a panic button. My team had a vehicle 2 blocks out. On the morning of March 9th, I knocked on the front door of Rosewood Manor. She answered almost immediately. Small, soft, silver hair pinned back neatly. Blue cardigan with little yellow flowers embroidered along the collar. She smelled like lavender and something baked, and she looked at me the way a grandmother looks at a kid who hasn't eaten in a while. She said, "Oh, sweetheart, come in out of the cold." If I hadn't known what I was walking into, I would have cried. Honestly. She was that warm. She sat me down at her kitchen table and made me chamomile tea while I told her the Hannah story. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she reached across the table and patted my hand and said, "You're safe here, dear." Room 204 was on the second floor. Clean, cedar-smelling, hand-stitched quilt on the bed. For about 30 seconds, I almost forgot what I was doing there. Then, on the second night, the house started talking back. I'd dismissed things the first night. Old houses settle, pipes knock. I told myself all of that. But at somewhere around 3 a.m. on my second night, I heard something inside the wall beside my bed that I could not explain away. Not settling, not a pipe. This was mechanical. A heavy, deliberate shifting sound, and then a metal latch, sliding, somewhere inside the wall about 3 feet from where I was lying. I didn't move. I lay there with my eyes open, and I listened for the next hour. I noted it in my investigator's log the next morning. I also noted something I had been quietly clocking since I arrived. The spatial dimensions of this house were off. The hallways were narrower than the exterior suggested. The rooms felt smaller than they should. City records had this building at just under 4,000 square feet. When I paced out the second-floor hallway and ran the math, I was coming up significantly short, by hundreds of square feet. There was space inside this house that wasn't on any floor plan. Dorothy had one live-in employee, a handyman named Frank Reed. Frank was tall, well over 6 feet, and completely, deliberately silent. He didn't make conversation with the tenants. He didn't make conversation with Dorothy, really, at least not that I witnessed. He lived in the basement and came up at night, Dorothy said, to fix the plumbing. I saw him in the hallway exactly once before I had real reason to be afraid. And the thing I remember is the way he moved, slowly, purposefully, the way something very patient moves when it isn't in any hurry, because it already knows how things end. I went back in my room and latched the door. On my 5th day in the house, a tenant named Craig Booth moved out. Dorothy announced it at breakfast with a warm smile and a small shake of her head, like she was happy for him but would miss him. Craig had found a better situation, she said. She was so pleased. I had spoken to Craig twice. He'd seemed foggy both times, the kind of exhausted that comes from years of hard living and not enough of anything. He had not mentioned any plans to leave. That afternoon, while Dorothy was at her church group, I picked the lock on Craig's room. His clothes were gone. His toiletries were gone. But on the nightstand, sitting in plain sight, was his medication organizer. I checked the label. Craig was diabetic, insulin dependent. The organizer had 5 days of doses still loaded into it. You don't leave your insulin when you move out. You can't forget it. Not if you need it to live. I went to the closet. Big old-fashioned wardrobe, solid dark wood. I went through it methodically, and when I pressed my palm flat against the back panel, it didn't push in, it swung. On a weighted hinge, perfectly balanced, perfectly silent. On the other side was a shaft, vertical, narrow, dropping straight down into the basement. Iron rungs bolted into the concrete wall on one side. I stood there with my penlight aimed into the darkness below, and I understood in that moment that I was standing inside a machine. This wasn't a quirk of old construction. This was engineered. Somebody had spent time and money and significant skill on this, and they had done it for a specific purpose. I radioed my team lead that night and told him I needed 48 more hours before we went in hard. I needed something a court couldn't dismiss. At 2 a.m. on my 7th day in the house, I picked the padlock on the basement door and went down. I had watched Frank's patterns carefully enough to know he usually went quiet around midnight. I waited the extra hour. I went slow on the stairs. The basement was not what I expected. It wasn't dark and chaotic. It was organized, almost methodical. Tools hung on pegboards. A heavy oak workbench sat in the center, under a row of overhead work lights. Metal shelving lined the far wall, and in the far corner, 3 large industrial vats were quietly steaming with a chemical smell that hit me on the second step down and didn't let go. Lye. The kind you use when you need something to stop existing. I kept moving, kept my light low. I reached the workbench and started scanning the shelves. There were objects on them, crafted things. A lampshade on a wire frame sitting at the end of the bench. Translucent, slightly yellowed material stretched over it. Faint, dark lines running through it like a road map. I think I already knew what it was before I let myself know what it was. The brain does that sometimes. It gets there before you're ready, and it just waits for you to catch up. It was human skin. My stomach dropped completely. I put a hand on the workbench to steady myself, and my elbow caught the edge of a metal tray. A wrench hit the concrete floor, and the sound split through the silence like something breaking. I froze. The far corner of the basement, the part still in total darkness, the part I hadn't gotten to yet, shifted. Frank Reed stepped out of the shadows. He had been standing there. Just standing there, in the dark, for however long. Waiting. I hit the panic button. He came at me fast, any faster than his size should have allowed, and I caught a glimpse of what he was holding before I was already moving. A bone saw, heavy-bladed, industrial. I didn't have time to clear my weapon. I grabbed the nearest lye vat and put my shoulder into it. It went over and hissed across the concrete between us, and Frank pulled back just enough. I ran for the stairs. I hit the door at the top so hard my shoulder went numb from it. The door didn't move. Through the wood, soft and warm and gentle as a lullaby, I heard Dorothy's voice. "I'm so sorry, Hannah." A beat. "But you do ask too many questions." She was standing on the other side of the door in her cardigan and her embroidered flowers, and she had locked me in. My panic button wasn't transmitting. I found out later that Frank had installed lead sheeting inside the basement walls. No signal in, no signal out. He had thought of everything. Frank was at the bottom of the stairs behind me, moving slowly now, patient. I thought about the shaft in the wardrobe. I thought about the ventilation system. Frank had routed it to push gas directly into the sleeping quarters, which meant it connected to the basement. And I thought about the main natural gas line running along the basement ceiling, the one I had clocked on my way down. the way I always clock utility lines out of habit. I went back down the stairs fast, wide around Frank, keeping the lie between us. And when I got to the far wall, I drew my Glock and fired 3 shots into the main gas line above the workbench. Then I sparked my lighter, and I dropped it. I got maybe 4 steps toward the ventilation shaft access panel. The explosion blew the bulkhead doors off the exterior of the house. The first floor windows shattered outward. The blast wave threw me into the stone wall, and I hit the ground, and for a few seconds I genuinely did not know which way was up, but I was breathing. There was light coming in through the blown-out bulkhead doors. I crawled toward it. By the time I pulled myself onto the lawn coughing, my tactical team was already moving up the property. Someone had the van up on the curb. Someone was shouting my name. Dorothy Wagner was sitting on the grass about 15 feet away. Blue cardigan, silver hair still pinned neatly back, watching her house burn with the same calm expression you'd have watching a sunset, clutching her purse in both hands. Inside the purse, investigators found Social Security disbursement cards for 11 different men. Frank Reed did not survive. Dorothy was arrested on the lawn that night. 11 counts of murder, along with a list of other charges, long enough to run for 2 pages. She died of a stroke in county jail 8 months later, before the case ever went to trial. The forensics team spent 3 weeks working through the ruins of Rosewood Manor after the fire was out. Inside the false walls, they found the mummified remains of 4 men. Beneath the basement floor, under a concrete layer Frank had poured himself at some point, they found fragments belonging to at least 7 more. 11 confirmed. The true number was probably higher. I called Nicole Merritt myself. I don't remember exactly what I said. I remember she went very quiet for a long time. And then she thanked me, and she hung up. I have thought about that phone call a lot over the years. I've thought about a lot of things from that case. I think about the chamomile tea. I think about the quilt on the bed in room 204. I think about how real Dorothy's warmth felt, how you could sit across from her at that kitchen table and genuinely feel like the world had soft edges again. That was the mechanism. That was the whole architecture of it. Not the gas lines, not the drop shafts, not the industrial vats in the basement. The real structure of Rosewood Manor was Dorothy's smile. Everything else was just the plumbing. I still measure rooms. I will probably never stop, because sometimes the danger isn't hiding somewhere inside the house. Sometimes the monster is the house. Story 2. The most terrifying killers are not the ones who lose control. They don't scare me. Rage is predictable. Passion has a shape. What terrifies me, what still keeps me awake in my 3rd-floor apartment, with the curtains drawn and a glass of water I never actually drink, is the killer who is methodical, patient, the one who treats death like a business plan and treats human beings like line items on a shipping manifest. I am Special Agent Claire Harmon, FBI Violent Crimes, Task Force, Pacific Northwest Division. I have worked 31 cases involving serial offenders. I have knelt in the dirt beside 22 bodies. I have sat across interrogation tables from men who smiled when they described what they did to people. None of it prepared me for what we found buried in those forests. I need to start with the smell. Every seasoned investigator has one. A smell that belongs to a specific case, one that bypasses language and goes straight to the place in your brain where the worst things live. For me, it is pine resin and frozen soil and something antiseptic underneath, something surgical that has no business being in a national forest at 3 in the morning. I will tell you why in a moment. First, I need to tell you about Leah. Leah Castillo was 22 years old. She had a partial college scholarship, a habit of sending her mother wildflower photographs she took on her phone, and a silver bracelet with a small turquoise stone she never took off. She disappeared from a highway rest stop on I-90 in eastern Washington on a Tuesday evening in July. She was last seen near the vending machines, getting into a dark cab-over truck. The local sheriff, Ray Dalton, filed a missing persons report and closed his notepad. He told Leah's mother that girls her age took off sometimes. He said it in a tone that implied the rest of the sentence, and I will not repeat what the rest of the sentence was. What I will tell you is that Ray Dalton was wrong, and his complacency cost us 73 days. Leah was found on October 14th. An elk hunter named Tom Sandoval stumbled across her body in a shallow ravine off a logging road in western Montana. He called it in on his satellite phone, hands shaking, and by noon my team was on site. The scene was wrong from the first second. I knew it the way you know a clock is off even before you consciously read the numbers, something in the arrangement of the world that does not match the natural order. There was no blood in the soil. None. Leah had not died in that ravine. She had been placed there, carefully, precisely, with deliberate hands, positioned like a package set down at a delivery address. When the medical examiner confirmed that Leah had been dead for no more than 48 hours, I did the math, standing in the tree line with frozen mud on my boots. She had been missing for 3 months. The math was simple, and the conclusion was horrifying. Someone had kept Leah Castillo alive for over 90 days before killing her. Someone had held a living human being in complete captivity for 3 months and then transported her body across state lines. I wrote in my investigator's journal that night, "Where do you keep a person for 3 months without a single neighbor hearing a scream? Not a basement, not a storage unit, not anywhere with an address." The answer came from the forensics. Leah's body had deep, repetitive ligature marks on both wrists. Not fresh marks, marks that had layered and scarred over weeks of chronic restraint. The pattern was consistent with suspension from a fixed overhead rig, a metal fixture at approximately ceiling height, the kind of load-bearing mount you would find in a warehouse or on a specialized piece of industrial equipment. The second anomaly was the tarp. Her body had been wrapped in a section of commercial-grade marine tarpaulin, the kind used to cover boat hulls and equipment loads, the kind sold by the pallet at marine supply chains and truck stop accessory stores. I pulled my laptop out in the field and started subpoenaing Department of Transportation way station records for the I-90 corridor. Every commercial vehicle crossing a way station in Montana, Idaho, and eastern Washington in the 48 hours surrounding Leah's estimated time of death. What I was looking for was a truck. What I found was a pattern that made my blood run cold. A Peterbilt 389 rig, registered to an independent owner-operator out of Spokane, had crossed way stations within 50 miles of 4 separate missing persons cases over the previous 26 months. 4 different women, 4 different jurisdictions, 1 truck. The owner-operator's name was Gary Thorne. Gary Thorne was 53 years old. He had been driving long haul since he was 25. No violent criminal record. 2 noise complaints at truck stops in Idaho. Nothing that would have flagged him in any database. He was invisible, the way a vehicle is invisible when you stop seeing vehicles and just see traffic. His fuel receipts were what sealed it. We cross-referenced his fuel card transactions against the last known locations of the missing women. The correlation was not circumstantial. It was a map. Every disappearance site had Gary Thorne's truck within a 40-mile radius on the day the woman vanished. We located him at a Flying J truck stop in Spokane on a Tuesday morning in February. My tactical team staged across the parking lot while I walked into the diner. Gary Thorne was at the counter eating scrambled eggs. He had a coffee mug in one hand and a folded newspaper on the stool beside him. He looked like every long-haul driver I had ever seen at every truck stop I had ever passed. He did not fight. He did not run. He put down his fork carefully, which I noted, and which told me a great deal about the kind of man he was, and he said, "I have been waiting for this." While Thorne was being processed in the parking lot, 3 members of my team breached the sleeper cab of his Peterbilt with a search warrant. I watched 2 of them come back out. I know what death smells like. I know what trauma smells like. That specific combination of fear and confinement and biological distress that soaks into surfaces over time. But what they described when they stepped back into the cold air was not death. It was the absence of death. It was bleach and ozone, and the sterile, processed smell of something scrubbed and disinfected to the point of clinical coldness. The sleeper cab had been retrofitted. The walls were lined with 6 inches of acoustic foam, military-grade soundproofing, the kind used in recording studios and server rooms. Welded to the reinforced ceiling was a steel gantry bar, load-tested with 2 specialized cuffs on a sliding track. The floor had drain channels. I stood in that cab for exactly 90 seconds. It was the longest 90 seconds of my professional life. In the interrogation room 3 hours later, Gary Thorne was the calmest person in the building. He folded his hands on the table and looked at the photographs of Leah Castillo and the 5 other women we had identified by that point. He did not look away. He studied them with an expression I could not name. Not regret, not pride, not indifference. Something clinical. Something administrative. I laid the evidence out. The way station data. The tarp material. The ligature analysis. The fuel receipts. He nodded slowly, like a man reviewing a report he had already approved. "I did not kill them, Agent Harmon," he said. "Your cab tells a different story, Gary. My cab tells you I kept them. It does not tell you I finished them." He paused. "Because I did not. I do not have the stomach for the end. I never did. I am just transport." I let the silence sit. In interrogation, silence is a tool. Thorne understood that. He let it sit too. Then he decided to talk, and what he told me changed the nature of everything we thought we were investigating. For 3 years, Thorne had been active on a dark web form accessible only through a layered encryption network. He communicated through coded messages with a user who operated under the handle Architect. Thorne's role was specific. He would identify vulnerable women, hitchhikers, rest-stop travelers, women at highway locations where surveillance was absent, and he would take them. He would keep them in the soundproofed cab. He would transport them to a set of GPS coordinates that the architect would transmit to a burner phone Thorne kept hidden in the dashboard. At the coordinates, always remote, always within federal timberland, Thorne would chain the woman to a specific tree. Then he would dig at the base of that tree because the architect had told him exactly what he would find. A Home Depot utility bucket, buried 2 feet down. Inside, cash. Thorne's payment. Thorne would take the money, cover the hole, and drive away. He told me this without any particular emotion in his voice. He described it the way a person describes a job they have done so many times. It no longer requires conscious attention. "You left them chained to the tree," I said. "Alive." "Yes." "And then what?" Then he came, Thorne said. The architect. He always came. That was his part. What Thorne described next required me to rebuild the entire investigation from the ground up. We were not dealing with a mobile serial killer operating from a truck. We were dealing with a system, a supply chain of murder, engineered by someone who understood with almost academic precision exactly why serial killers get caught. Geographic profiling works because killers operate in comfort zones. They abduct and dispose near home, near work, near familiar territory. The architect had studied this. He had designed his method as a direct countermeasure. He did not abduct. He hired someone else to abduct. He did not kill near his home. He flew into airports hundreds of miles from his residence, rented cars under stolen or fabricated identities, drove to remote forest locations he had never visited under any suspicious circumstances, and used pre-staged equipment he had buried months or years earlier. No weapons on airplanes, no receipts for restraint equipment, no cell phone pings near abduction sites, no connection to any of the victims in any searchable database. The buried buckets were the key. He would visit national forests during family vacations or business travel, choose remote locations off discontinued logging roads, and bury a sealed bucket containing everything he would need. Cash for Thorne, zip ties, a suppressed pistol, a quantity of sodium hydroxide, and a burner phone preloaded with a single contact number. Then he would go home and wait, sometimes for 6 months, sometimes for over a year. Our BAU profiler, Marcus Webb, put it this way in his formal assessment. The architect does not kill from compulsion in any traditional sense. He kills for what he experiences as administrative completion. The buried kits are not merely tool. They are anchors, investments. He has constructed a system that allows him to experience the crime in stages, over an extended period, beginning with site selection and kit burial and ending with execution. Each stage delivers a discrete psychological reward. The act of killing is simply the final transaction in a lengthy project. Marcus told me that over the phone at 1 a.m, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of the field office for 20 minutes afterward without moving. We could not find the architect through digital forensics. He was too disciplined. The encryption on the dark web form was military grade. The cryptocurrency payments to Thorne's accounts moved through 17 wallets across 9 countries. Every rental car had been secured with documentation fabricated well enough to pass basic dealership verification. We could not track him. We could not find his center. We could not predict his next move. We had one option. We had to bring him to us. I went to my special agent in charge with the operation proposal on a Monday afternoon. I put the plan on the table. We would force Thorne to initiate contact through the forum. We would offer the architect a delivery. We would give him a set of coordinates, one of Thorne's historical drop zones in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho, and we would wait, and someone would have to be chained to the tree. I want to be precise about why I volunteered for that role, because it was not bravado and it was not a lack of options. It was operational logic. The architect was meticulous. He would approach the drop site on his own timeline, in complete darkness, and he would verify the delivery before committing to the act. If what was chained to that tree was a mannequin or an obvious plant, he would walk away and we would never get another opportunity. It had to be a real person. It had to be someone who could hold still, hold their nerve, and hold a tactical release latch in the cold for however long it took. I put my own name on the proposal. My SAC stared at me for a long time. "Claire," she said. "It is the only way," I told her, and it was. We had 72 hours from the moment the forum message went out. Thorne, under close supervision, sent the coded notification at 11 a.m. on a Thursday, a live one, ready for delivery. The architect responded at 8 a.m. the following morning. One message, GPS coordinates and a date. The Bitterroot National Forest, Idaho. A logging access road that had not been maintained since the late 1980s. 43 miles from the nearest cell tower. 3 days. The FBI hostage rescue team staged their perimeter over 2 nights. 60 operators. Ghillie suits treated with thermal dampening material. No vehicle lights within 5 miles of the drop zone. No communication except encrypted earpiece, single channel, single word verification codes. At 11 o'clock on a Saturday night in November, Thorne's truck turned off the main highway and followed a dirt access road into the trees. It was 13 degrees. There was no moon. The forest was the kind of dark that has texture, a dense, pressing blackness that your eyes never fully adjust to. I was in the truck cab, and I want to tell you honestly that those 40 minutes in that cab, listening to the chains rattle against the gantry while Thorne drove without speaking, were the worst 40 minutes of my career. Not because I was afraid of Thorne. He was compliant and finished, because of what the cab smelled like, because I was sitting in the space where Leah Castillo had spent 90 days, and I was understanding in my body what that had meant. Understanding it in a way that reading a forensics report cannot teach you. The truck stopped. Thorne got out without a word. I heard his footsteps on frozen ground moving away. The forest silence filled in behind him. I was chained to an old-growth ponderosa pine with a 14-inch diameter. The cuffs were equipped with a tactical magnetic release that I could trip with a quarter turn of my right thumb. My sidearm was in a concealed cross-draw holster at my left hip. My wire was active. My tracking beacon was transmitting. Marcus Webb, monitoring from a mobile command unit 4 miles back, was talking me through the situation with the measured cadence of someone who understood that the words themselves mattered less than the tone. I waited. 1 hour, 2 hours. The temperature dropped. The trees moved in a wind I could not feel at ground level. Somewhere in the dark above me, a branch snapped, and my body sent approximately 47 simultaneous alarm signals that I overruled one by one. At 4 a.m., I heard boots on a frozen pine duff. The sound was almost nothing. A professional's footfall, deliberate, evenly spaced, zero urgency. Someone who had done this before. Someone who was completely at ease in the dark, in the cold, in the forest, at 4 in the morning. He appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision, like a shape materializing from the tree line. He was wearing a fleece jacket, dark olive green, hiking boots with good ankle support, a small day pack. He carried a compact red lens flashlight and moved it in a short, efficient arc across the ground in front of him. He was not large. He was not physically imposing. He looked like someone's accountant, someone's neighbor. The kind of man you see at a school function and immediately forget. He swept the flashlight beam up and found my face. He looked at me for approximately 4 seconds. His expression did not change. There was no excitement, no agitation, no obvious gratification. He looked at me the way you look at a package on your doorstep, confirming delivery, confirming condition. Then he knelt at the base of the ponderosa pine and began to dig with a folding camp trowel. The soil was frozen at the surface, but loose underneath. He worked efficiently. 18 inches down, the trowel hit plastic. He brushed the soil aside with his free hand, located the lid handle, and lifted the bucket out. He set it on the frozen ground beside him. He opened it. He reached in and removed a suppressed pistol. He racked the slide once to confirm the chambered round. He began to rise. I tripped the release on the cuffs. The tactical lights came on, 60 halogen beams instantaneous, flooding the tree line with white light that turned the entire forest into a crime scene. Photograph. I had my sidearm drawn and leveled before he fully registered what was happening. He did not run. He did not raise the weapon. He stood perfectly still, blinking in the light, and then very slowly and deliberately, he bent back down and placed the pistol into the open bucket. He straightened up. He put his hands at his sides. The HRT operators were moving through the trees. I could hear them. The crunch of 60 sets of boots, the click of equipment, radio clicks confirming sectors clear. The man looked at me. His expression was the first genuine expression I had seen from him. Not fear, not rage, not panic. It was something smaller and stranger. It was disappointment. The disappointment of someone who has submitted a flawless project and found a single clerical error on the final page. He said very quietly, "The logistics failed." Those were the first and last spontaneous words he ever said to me. His name was Brian Kelly. He was 44 years old. He lived in a 4-bedroom house in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. He had a wife, 2 teenage sons, a perfect credit record, and a standing tea time every Saturday morning. He had been doing this for 6 years. We had the house torn apart by the following evening. His wife, Sophie, sat in a neighbor's kitchen with a blanket around her shoulders and a look on her face that I have seen on spouses and children and parents in that circumstance. A look that is not quite shock and not quite grief, but something that sits between them, some new emotional state that the human face invents on the spot because nothing in ordinary life requires it. We found nothing in the main living spaces, nothing in the garage, nothing in the attic or the crawl space. The basement wall was where he had hidden it. Behind a section of standard drywall installed 18 months earlier, according to the permit records, was a shallow alcove. Inside the alcove was a fireproof document box. Inside the box was his ledger. He had kept a paper ledger. Not a digital file. Paper. Handwritten in a neat, small script with a black felt-tip pen. Every operation documented. Location of the buried kit. Date of burial. GPS coordinates. Date of activation. Outcome. Rental car confirmations. Flight itineraries with the airline and terminal annotated. A cash flow sheet tracking payments to Thorne. And stapled to the inside back cover of the ledger was a folded map of the continental United States. He had marked 22 locations with red dots. We had found 6 bodies. There were 22 dots. I stood in that basement alcove holding the map under a flashlight, and I counted the red dots 3 times because my brain refused to accept the number on the first 2 counts. 16 buried kill kits were still out there, in forests across the country, some of them activated, meaning there may be remains we had not found, some of them dormant, meaning no victim had yet been brought to those coordinates. That map is the thing I carry with me, not the sleeper cab, not the tree line at 4 a.m. The map, 16 red dots, 16 locations where Brian Kelly had knelt in the dirt on a family vacation or a business trip and buried a sealed bucket and walked back to his rental car and driven away, knowing that those coordinates were waiting for him, patient as the soil itself. Thorne died before his trial. He was found in his holding cell, and I will not describe the method except to say that it required nothing more than time and ingenuity and the materials of his own clothing. Even at the very end, he found a way to use what was around him. Brian Kelly was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of kidnapping, conspiracy charges, and a set of federal racketeering charges that his defense team fought for 2 years and lost cleanly. He is at ADX Florence in Colorado, the federal Supermax facility, the place where the most dangerous men in the country are housed in individual concrete. Cells 23 hours a day. Once a year, I fly to Colorado. I sit in a visiting room behind reinforced glass, and I look at Brian Kelly, and I ask him for the GPS coordinates of the remaining buried sites. He is always calm. He is always neatly groomed. He folds his hands on the table the same way Thorne folded his hands, and I have never been able to decide whether that similarity is meaningful or whether I am the one projecting meaning onto a gesture, because I need the world to make sense. He looks at me with that same administrative patience he carried into the forest. No hostility. No performance. Just a man who has decided exactly how much he will give, and has not revised that decision in 8 years. "Agent Harmon," he said the last time I sat across from him, "you are a thorough person. I have always respected that about you. The coordinates, Brian." He smiled. Not wide, not theatrical. The small, precise smile of a man who is satisfied with his position. "They are investments," he told me. "You don't liquidate your assets all at once. That is not how responsible management works." I drove back to the airport in a rental car on an empty Colorado highway, and I thought about what Marcus Webb had told me in the early days of the investigation, that the buried kits were anchors, that each one represented a stage in an extended psychological project, that the act of burial itself had been pleasurable for Brian Kelly, that he had knelt in the dirt of a national forest while his sons ate lunch at a nearby picnic table, and he had felt something that I do not have a clean word for. He still feels it. That is what I have come to understand. The 16 remaining kits are not just withheld information. They are his last remaining territory, the only ground he still owns. In a concrete cell with a 6-inch window and no human contact outside of supervised visits, those coordinates are the one thing that has not been taken from him. They are the final expression of control available to a man who built his entire psychology around the idea that control was the only thing worth having. I have thought a great deal about what Leah Castillo's mother said to me at the conclusion of the trial. She is a quiet woman named Patricia, and she waited until everyone else had left the courthouse steps, and she walked up to me and took both of my hands in hers. She said, "You found my daughter. You brought her back to us. Even at the end, you brought her back." I did not tell her about the 16 red dots. That was not a burden Patricia needed to carry. It is mine. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from a case like this. It is not the exhaustion of long hours or physical demand. It is the exhaustion of having looked directly at something that most human beings are designed to look away from. The realization that evil is not always chaotic, not always impulsive, not always recognizable. Sometimes evil is organized, sometimes evil files its receipts and balances its ledger and tucks its children into bed at night and sets an alarm for 6 in the morning. The I-90 corridor still runs through eastern Washington and into Montana. Trucks still move along it day and night, long-haul rigs carrying freight and cargo and the invisible, ordinary weight of commerce. Families still drive it on summer vacations. The Bitterroot Mountains still stand the way they have always stood, indifferent and enormous and full of old-growth timber and frozen soil and silence. Somewhere in forests across this country, 16 Home Depot buckets are buried in the dark, sealed, waiting, patient. I think about them on the interstate. I think about them when I pass a truck stop and see a rig idling in the parking lot with its running lights on and its curtains drawn. I think about them when I look at a map, a real map, a paper map, the kind that shows national forests as pale green fields and logging roads as thin dotted lines, and I trace the geography with my finger, looking for the gaps, the dead zones, the places where the asphalt cuts through millions of acres of federal timberland and the cell towers run out and the jurisdictions argue and nobody is watching. That is where he planned. That is where he buried his work. And somewhere between those dots and the men who will never tell me where they are, there are families who are still waiting for a phone call that should have come years ago. Mothers who left wildflowers on a windowsill. Sisters who kept a voicemail they cannot bring themselves to delete. People living inside a question that deserves an answer. I carry those questions with me the way Leah Castillo carried her turquoise bracelet. Every day, without taking it off. The case is closed. The work is not. Story 3. Some inheritances don't come in envelopes. They don't come with lawyers or notarized documents or tearful readings in a living room full of flowers. Some inheritances come wrapped in rope. In the cold methodology of a man who taught his son not how to be good in the world, but how to destroy it. My name is Vivian Harrington. I spent 11 years with the FBI's Cryptanalysis and Records Analysis Unit, CRAU, based out of Quantico. I have decoded ransom notes, terrorist manifestos, and the private journals of men who believed that the written word could protect them from justice. I have stared at symbols for so many consecutive hours that when I finally close my eyes at night, I still see them burning on the insides of my eyelids. I retired from active field work in the spring of 2021. I tell people it was the hours. The truth is more complicated than that. The truth is a name. 2 names, actually. The same last name. And what happened when I finally connected them? This is the case I cannot stop carrying. It began the way the worst cases always do. Quietly, in a suburb where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Daniel and Christine Townsend lived in a gated development in Pleasant Hill, California, a community that advertised itself on real estate websites with words like safe and close-knit and family-oriented. 2 cars in the driveway, a Ring camera at the front door, a golden retriever named Clifford, who slept at the foot of their bed. They were the kind of family whose Christmas card you'd tape to your refrigerator without really thinking about it. On the morning of September 3rd, 2018, a neighbor noticed the Townsend's front door was ajar. By the time local police arrived, they found both Daniel and Christine bound in the master bedroom with military-grade zip ties. Christine had survived. Daniel had not. The responding officers described a scene of extraordinary deliberateness. Nothing was taken. No ransacking, no robbery, nothing. Opportunistic. Every object in that room had been carefully moved and repositioned. The killer had rearranged the furniture so that both victims would face each other during what happened. He wanted them to watch. 2 days after the discovery, the San Francisco Chronicle received a letter. The envelope was sealed with a standard stamp, postmarked from Oakland. Inside was a single sheet of plain white paper, covered edge to edge in hand-drawn symbols. Not letters, not numbers. A constructed alphabet of geometric shapes, inverted signs, and what appeared to be modified astronomical notation. At the very bottom of the page, in ordinary block letters, was a single sentence. This is just the first lesson. That sentence made it federal. I received the case file on a Thursday afternoon. My supervisor, Nicholas Johnston, set it on my desk and said nothing. He didn't need to. I had been doing this long enough to read the weight of a folder before I opened it. I made a cup of coffee, sat down, and opened it. By the time the coffee went cold, I had run the cipher through 3 separate analytical frameworks and received no clean output. That was not unusual. What was unusual was what happened when I uploaded a high-resolution scan of the symbol page into our VICAP analytical system and cross-referenced it against our historical cold case archives. The match came back at 96%. I stared at the screen for a long time. I read the source case number twice. Then I pulled the corresponding file from the archive, a physical file, because the case was old enough that significant portions of it had never been digitized, and I laid it on the desk beside the new cipher. The structural similarity was undeniable. The same geometric foundations, the same inverted astronomical signs, the same syntactical logic buried in the visual chaos. The source case was from 1976. The suspect, never apprehended, was known in our records as the Coastal Line Killer. He had operated across a stretch of Northern California for nearly 8 years, from 1973 to 1981. 11 confirmed victims, though investigators at the time believed the actual number was higher. He had sent 5 letters to Bay Area newspapers during that period, each containing a cipher of escalating complexity. The last letter arrived in March 1981. After that, nothing. The case went cold, and eventually the case files went into storage, and eventually most people forgot about the Coastal Line Killer entirely. That was 37 years ago. And now someone was using the same cipher architecture. The most obvious explanation, the one the BAU floated within the first week, was a copycat. Someone who had studied the original case, obtained reference materials, and deliberately replicated the symbolic style as a kind of homage or tribute. It wasn't unheard of. Men who admired other men's violence existed in uncomfortable abundance. But there was a problem with the copycat theory. A problem that took me 3 weeks and 2 sleepless weekends to fully articulate. And when I finally did, I presented it to Nicholas in his office with a single typed page that I set on his desk the same way he had set the case file on mine. The cipher was not a replication of the Coastal Line Killer's style. It was a continuation of it. The encoding logic, the specific mathematical relationship between the primary symbols and their substitution values, was built on a key sequence that appeared nowhere in any public record, any academic analysis, any journalistic reconstruction of the original case. The FBI had developed a partial understanding of this key sequence in 1979, and that partial understanding was classified. It existed in a single internal memo, authored by the lead cryptanalyst on the original investigation, and it had never been shared outside the Bureau. A copycat, working from available sources, could not have constructed this cipher. The key was not guessable. It was not derivable. It had to have been known, which meant either someone inside the FBI had leaked a classified 40-year-old memo, or the person who built the original key was still alive and had passed it on. I remember the exact moment the full shape of it came clear to me. I was standing at the corkboard in the CRAU lab at 2 a.m. with a red marker in my hand, and I had been drawing connection lines between index cards for hours, and then I stopped drawing and just stood there. The lab was completely silent. Outside the window, the Virginia sky was going gray-blue with the first suggestion of dawn. 2 killers, 2 different men. One cipher language built on the same mathematical skeleton. A father teaching his son the family trade. I have worked many dark cases. I have read the confessions of men who did things that should not be thinkable. But I have never felt what I felt at that moment. A cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, spreading through my chest, like slow water through cracked concrete. I sat back down at my desk. I started building the profile. The son was young, late 20s to mid-30s, based on the physical evidence at the Townsend scene. Athletic, disciplined, and technically proficient. The bindings were not improvised. They reflected training or extensive preparation. His methodology, the deliberate arrangement of the scene, the forced participation of the surviving victim, the complete absence of theft or sexual motivation, indicated someone for whom control was the entire point. Not pleasure in the ordinary sense. Power. The letter confirmed a second motivation, audience. He wasn't just killing, he was announcing himself. And crucially, the way the letter was addressed, the specific phrasing of the first lesson, the language of performance and education, I began to wonder whether his intended audience wasn't the public at all. By October, there had been 2 more attacks. A retired couple in Walnut Creek, both deceased. A single man in his 50s in Concord who survived only because a neighbor called the police in response to a noise complaint that turned out to be the sound of the victim struggling. He could not identify his attacker. He said the man had never spoken a single word. 3 more letters arrived at the Chronicle. Each one used the same foundational cipher architecture. Each one was more complex than the last, more elaborate, more precise, showing a demonstrable growth in technical sophistication from letter to letter. It was not the behavior of someone operating from a static template. It was the behavior of someone practicing, showing off. The thought arrived with such clarity that I wrote it in my case journal in capital letters. He is not writing to us. He is writing to his father. The decoded content of the second and third letters reinforced this. The language was not addressed to law enforcement or to the public. The phrasing was intimate, competitive, almost filial. One passage, once decoded, read, "The knot I use is tighter. I do not leave witnesses who can describe my voice." Another, "Your architecture was good. Mine is better. You should see what I have built." He was using the front page of the largest newspaper in California as a private communication channel. He assumed, correctly for a time, that no one would crack the cipher quickly enough to understand what they were actually reading. And beneath the public performance, there was this raw, ugly thing, a son trying to make his father proud. The question of whether the father was still alive, still reading, was one we needed to answer. And the only way to answer it was to do something that made Nicholas Johnston go very quiet for a very long time when I proposed it. We needed to write back. The plan required a level of coordination between the Bureau and the Chronicle's editorial staff that I cannot fully describe without losing the thread of this story. What I will say is that the Chronicle's editor understood the stakes immediately and agreed without hesitation. My partner, Seth Laird, spent 4 days helping me construct the response cipher. We built it on the original 1979 key framework, the classified internal memo, which we were now authorized to use operationally. If the coastal line killer was alive and still reading the Chronicle, if he had been following his son's letters with the pride of a man watching his legacy unfold, he would recognize the key instantly. No one else would. The message, once encoded, filled a quarter-page advertisement space that the Chronicle ran on a Sunday morning in late October 2018. Anyone looking at it would have seen a block of dense, decorative symbols that could be mistaken for abstract art or a promotional puzzle. To the son, it would read like static. To the father, it would read like a voice from the past reaching out through a keyhole. Decoded, it said, "You taught well. The pupil has made errors. Meet at the place where it started. Show him where he is wrong." Where it started was a reference pulled from the original 1973 case file, a rural turnout along a county road near an old reservoir outside Vallejo that investigators had identified as the site of the Coastal Line killer's first confirmed homicide. It was a specific enough reference that only the original killer would recognize it. Vague enough that a law enforcement leak would not compromise the operation. We set up surveillance at the site 48 hours in advance. Seth coordinated with the tactical team. I drove up from Quantico to be on site because I had been living inside this case for 3 months, and I needed to see the end of it with my own eyes. For 2 nights, we sat in the dark and the cold, and nothing came. On the 3rd night at 11:40 p.m., a pair of headlights appeared on the access road. The vehicle, a late-model pickup truck, stopped at the gate and sat idling for nearly 4 minutes, long enough that I thought whoever was inside had smelled the trap. Then the door opened. He was tall, mid-30s, dressed in dark clothing, moving with the deliberateness that was almost ceremonial. He stood outside the truck for a moment, looking at the reservoir, and the expression on his face, I could see it clearly in the night vision feed, was something I would not know how to name. Not anticipation, not excitement. Something older and quieter than either of those things. He was waiting to meet a ghost. He was waiting for his father to come home to him. Instead, he got 11 federal agents, laser sights, and my voice through a megaphone, telling him to put his hands above his head. He complied without resistance. He dropped to his knees in the gravel and locked his hands behind his head with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this scenario. Not as a surrender, but as a performance, even now. As I cuffed him, he looked up at me and said, "He didn't send it, did he?" Not a question. A statement. Flat, calm, resolved. I didn't answer. I walked him to the vehicle and handed him to Seth. And then I stood at the edge of the reservoir for a moment in the dark because I needed 30 seconds of silence before the next part of this began. His name, as we learned within the hour from his vehicle registration, was Declan Stanton, 34 years old, an architectural drafter with a firm in Oakland. Clean record. No priors, no flags, no obvious breaks from normal life. His co-workers, when contacted the following morning, described him as precise, quiet, and extremely good at his job. He refused to identify his father. During processing, during preliminary questioning, during the first formal interview, nothing. He sat across the table from me with a calm that I found more unsettling than rage would have been, and he told me, with something that might have been affection, that I wouldn't find the old man without him. We found the old man from his GPS history. The device in Declan's truck had recorded a route made 11 days earlier to a rural property in a county east of Vallejo, a small parcel of land with a single-story structure on it, registered under a holding company that required 3 additional corporate shells to unravel and eventually resolve to a name that made the 2 senior investigators in our war room go completely still when it appeared on the screen. Richard Stanton, 71 years old, retired. The database cross-reference against the Coastal Line killer investigation, physical description, geographic history, partial fingerprints recovered from a 1977 scene that had never matched any known subject, took 6 minutes, and came back clean. A clean match. We had him. My tactical team breached the property at dawn. There was no confrontation. The door was unlocked. We moved through a small, dim house that smelled of medication and old paper. And in the back bedroom, on a hospital bed, with an oxygen concentrator running quietly beside it, was an old man. He did not look like a monster. They rarely do by the time you find them. He was thin, gray-skinned, his breathing labored, his eyes tracking us, with an intelligence that had not dimmed despite what was clearly a serious and advanced illness. He watched us move through his room without speaking, without moving, without any change in expression. The walls told the story instead. Every inch of available wall space was covered. Framed newspaper clippings, laminated case summaries from press coverage, photographs of locations he had likely selected for operational reasons, hand-drawn maps and diagrams and symbol sequences that filled entire sheets of drafting paper. It was an archive, a shrine, 40 years of documentation, organized with a precision that I recognized immediately. The same precision I had seen in his son's cipher letters, the same architectural clarity, the same quiet, obsessive intelligence passed perfectly from one generation to the next. On the small writing desk beside his bed was a single sheet of paper. On it, partially completed, was a cipher. The same foundational architecture, the same inverted notation, the same substitution logic his son had used. He had been trying to write back. He had been trying to answer his son. Richard Stanton died in a federal medical facility 14 weeks later. He died without making a formal statement, without confirming his identity, without speaking a single word to any law enforcement officer. The DNA confirmation, matched from samples obtained from the 1977 evidence, and from a mandatory swab taken upon his arrest, was sufficient. 11 cold case files were formally resolved. The families of those victims received notification letters. I have thought, in the years since, about what those letters must have felt like to open. I have thought about it more than is probably useful. Declan Stanton is incarcerated. He will not leave prison. During our final formal interview, conducted 6 months after his arrest as part of the evidentiary process, he was composed, cooperative in a selective way, and entirely without remorse. I asked him one question outside the official case record. I asked him why. Why choose this? Why choose any of it when by every external measure he had a life, a career, a future? He looked at me and he smiled, a small, private smile like I had asked something slightly naive, and he said, "Some families have a business, Agent Harrington. You don't let it die. You improve the model. I have carried that sentence for years. I have turned it over in my hands the way you turn over a stone to see what lies underneath, trying to find the ordinary explanation inside it, the recognizable psychology, the thing that makes it make sense in some framework I can file away and stop thinking about. I have not found it yet. What I know is this: evil is not always born in isolation. Sometimes it is nurtured. Sometimes it is inherited with the careful intention of a man who wanted to leave something of himself in the world and chose the most unforgivable possible way to do it. The cipher was the language. The murders were the message. The son was the legacy. I keep a photograph of Christine Townsend on the wall of my home office, not as a reminder of the worst of the case, but as a reminder of the thing that survived it. She testified at Declan's sentencing. She stood at the podium in a courtroom in San Francisco, and she spoke for 11 minutes about her husband and about the night she will never stop living inside, and her voice did not break once. I think about her voice sometimes when the work gets heavy. I think about how much it takes to speak clearly in the presence of the thing that nearly destroyed you. The cipher has been declassified and archived. The key is on record now. If Richard Stanton taught anyone else, if there are other students of his terrible curriculum who have not yet introduced themselves to us, we will recognize the language when they write it. We are watching. We are still watching.